The sovereign debt situation in countries in the global south has worsened dramatically under the impression of multiple crises, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the repercussions of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. Debt relief is therefore high on the political agenda. For the German G7 presidency, addressing sovereign debt crisis is even a priority. More than 60% of claims to developing countries are held by private creditors, but so far they've refused to contribute. Instead of decisive action to force private creditors to participate in debt restructurings, the G7 under the German leadership so far only blamed China.
At the G7 finance minister meeting in May 2022, there have been no concrete measures taken to tackle the current sovereign debt crisis. We've spoken to three eminent experts on this matter and asked why we need to take action now.
What world do we want to live in? I think that ultimately is kind of where I am. I mean, like all finance, debt relief, both ex-ante borrowing and debt restructuring, they're all a means to an end. You want children to go to school and not go hungry. That's sort of what it's about. You can see increasingly just these enormous external shocks, be it the pandemic or, violence or climate, that don't just hit the poorest, most heavily indebted countries. They might hit a middle income, otherwise perfectly sustainable debt stock country. But we need to have the capacity to respond quickly in a way that does not get us bogged down in, transaction costs and negotiations. We need a nimble system with a very clear and well-motivated backstop. And I think that legislation is a terrific backstop.
The problem today is that we face major challenges in many respects that rely and that have as a prerequisite a financially sound and solid state. And that financial soundness and solidity depends on a very small group of, for the most part, relatively rich investors from relatively few industrialized countries. We also have to face the fact that why we are doing this, we're doing that mainly to fight climate change or to fight the consequences of it, to fight problems of health, problems of demographics, problems of security, etc. And that is something that concerns every state, every EU state, every G7 state, regardless of whatever China is doing. So there are not just obligations, I would say, on the basis of human rights, but there are massive interests, I would say, on the part of these states to put other developing emerging economies, in particular, in the position to be financially solid, to take the measures they need to take on important policies now and not later, and not at some point when China finally agrees on giving them a debt restructuring. Yeah, and so it's even against our best interests to hide behind China. And maybe, if you have such an international comprehensive procedure at some point, that might set a standard that China or any third-party investor, Russia, will not be able to undercut.
We are dealing with some very well-capitalized institutions who make their living off of this kind of behavior, and they are prepared to spend a great deal of money to lobby, to frighten politicians with these arguments that this will end the asset class and that it will only unleash perfidious, prodigal sovereigns to demand debt relief without sufficient cause. And this is another fallacy. The fallacy is that sovereigns sit out there looking for an opportunity to default on their debt. It is exactly the opposite. The sovereigns typically go to extraordinary lengths to continue servicing their external debt long after the time that they should have stopped. Sri Lanka today is in that position. It doesn't have any reserves left to import food, fuel, fertilizer. Why? Because they spent their money trying to keep current on their external debt. But you're dealing with institutions that are prepared to lobby in a powerful way to preserve this curious gap in our legal system. We solved this for corporate debtors 100 years ago, but it is because sovereigns lost their absolute immunity that we're now having to deal with it for this, think of it this way, suddenly exposed category of debtor, not eligible for our domestic bankruptcy regime.
The scary part is that I don't think that you're going to see much action until you actually see a wave of disruptive defaults. And the miracle has been that you haven't seen them, even though they've been predicted for going on 3 years. You know, no telling when this is going to explode, but I'm afraid as a practical matter, it's hard to see a lot of action given everything else that these governments are doing, right? So, I mean, it's in some ways, everyone is kind of doing what's right in front of their nose.
The first thing would be to change its international political approach, because despite everything that has been said in the present or past coalition agreements, we know very well that Germany very often has been standing on the brake. And that concerns particularly the Treasury Minister under various different leaderships. They could also be more open to a diversity of fora for discussion.
It's more than symbolism, particularly if you have the presidency of the G7. That gives you what we call bully pulpit. It gives you a basis on which to put proposals before the G7 and try to get them to endorse them. G7, a smaller and frankly more cohesive group, but the G7 countries, the financial markets are really in the G7 countries, would have a very powerful role to play if they could come up with a common approach to this.
The German government has included the support of a codified sovereign insolvency mechanism in its coalition agreement. This is already a very strong signal. Now we need to bring this commitment to life. Improving legal conditions for debt restructurings at the national level is a key step in this direction. Instead of finger pointing to China, the goal must be to involve all creditors into debt restructurings, and the largest group is private creditors.
The G7 could increase the incentive for China to cooperate by better involving private creditors. If the German government takes concrete steps now in the context of the German G7 presidency, this also makes significant contributions to fulfilling the German coalition agreement. We therefore call on G7 leaders who are meeting in a few days in Elmau to take action and to initiate national legislation to improve sovereign debt restructurings.